When it comes to co-op games, I'm always trying to dig deep and find those great games that other people haven't talked about much. Let's talk about Couch Co-op Hidden Gems, Part 3. The first game I want to talk about is called G.I. Joe Cobra Strike, and the reason why I wanted to include this game is because it came out on the Atari 2600. Just in general, when it comes to co-op gaming, it's not really a console that most people think about. You often associate it with competitive games, but there are a handful of really cool co-op games. This is one of them. This game only came out on the Atari 2600 and it has some really unique gameplay. First of all, it's a paddle control game. The gameplay is similar to other titles from the time, such as Breakout, Kaboom, or even Pong. But what sets this game apart from other Breakout-inspired games is the fact that you can play it cooperatively, using 2 paddle controllers. However, instead of bouncing a ball with the paddles, your goal is to protect the running men below by blocking the missiles being dropped by the giant Cobra. On top of blocking the attacks, you are able to shoot the Cobra with missiles from the cannons on both sides. But in order to do so, you need to first move your paddle over to your cannon and then press the fire button. Once your men are all destroyed, the game ends. As mentioned before, this is a true co-op game. Unlike other 2600 games that feature co-op, this one does not have a competitive aspect. The score is shared between players, and working together is required to move forward. The giant Cobra must be hit around 8 times in order to move to the next level. You will then be presented with an almost identical Cobra, but with different colors. The graphics are simple, however the giant Cobra sprite, it's pretty impressive for the 2600 hardware. This game came out in 1983. It may be simple, and the visuals are definitely basic, but the gameplay is solid, and that's all that matters. So if I had to recommend one co-op game on the Atari 2600, G.I. Joe Cobra Strike would be that game. Shinrei Jusatsushi Tarōmaru on the Sega Saturn came out exclusively in Japan. This is a side-scrolling run-and-gun action platforming game, where you play as these 2 ninja characters. But it stands out from other run-and-gun games as you don't just kind of mindlessly shoot. While you are controlling your character, you're also controlling a cursor, which is how you attack the enemies. And this does take a little bit of getting used to. The only game I can think of that I could compare this game to is Elysia Dragoon that came out on the Sega Genesis. It has a similar cursor shooting mechanic. But the thing that I love about this game is that it is constantly moving forward. There's no transition between levels. Once you beat a boss, you move forward to the next boss, and it is completely seamless with no load screens. And the action is just non-stop. I've heard a lot more people talk about this game in recent years, but for a long time, this was a completely unknown game that only die-hard Sega Saturn fans knew about. But if you're just now digging into the import Sega Saturn library, maybe you haven't heard of this one, so I highly recommend you try it out. Krazy Kreatures on the NES is an unlicensed game. Usually when you hear of unlicensed games, it's kind of a red flag because the quality isn't quite top-notch. But this one stands out. Not only is the gameplay very unique, it works really well as a co-op game, but it's something that you kind of just have to play to fully understand. On the surface, it's just a matching game. You basically just want to line up the various creatures, and all that you control is a little cursor. It sounds really basic, and the concept is, but once you get into it, it is very addicting, and it moves very fast. When you're playing with a friend, it can actually get pretty chaotic as the creatures start filling up the screen faster and faster, and you gotta match them up to make them disappear. Just describing this and showing it does not do the game justice. It's something you really just gotta play. It's way more fun than it looks, I promise. This is actually one of my favorite co-op games on the NES. Nightmare Busters was created way back in the mid-90s, but was ultimately shelved. Outside of a prototype that was floating around for a while, people didn't see this game for years. But finally, in 2013, the game was finished and released on the Super Nintendo. It's a pretty straightforward run-and-gun platformer. What really makes it stand out are the visuals. There's so much color and detail in the backgrounds and the character designs. It's not unlike Contra or Gunstar Heroes. It's a pretty fast-paced run-and-gun platformer. You play as 2 twin brothers, Flynn and Floyd, in their journey to stop whatever the enemy's name is, blah blah blah. Story doesn't matter in this kind of game whatsoever. The gameplay is solid, okay? And I did not know this game even existed until recently. So if you missed this one, definitely give it a shot. Return to Castle Wolfenstein is a first-person shooter that came out on the PlayStation 2, Mac, PC, and the original Xbox. Now this game is definitely not a hidden gem in and of itself, but the version that I'm talking about on the original Xbox, which has an exclusive couch co-op mode that is only on the original Xbox, made me want to talk about it because I feel like that might have slid under some people's radar. You can play through the entire story in split-screen co-op. The second player can play as Agent 1, which alters the game and story. It's not one of the best first-person shooters, but it was a pretty good one for the time. And basically any story-based game that's focused on co-op definitely gets some extra points for me in my book. So if you ever go back and want to play Return to Castle Wolfenstein, I definitely recommend you play the original Xbox version. Another first-person shooter that I want to talk about is called Gloom. This came out on the Amiga, and it's a very clear Doom ripoff. But the main benefit is it can be played in split-screen co-op. It has the same over-the-top violence and first-person gameplay. Unfortunately, when playing in split-screen, the viewable screen is pretty small, the resolution is pretty low, and there might be some performance issues. But it's still a really fun game, and it might be one of the first split-screen co-op first-person shooters. Don't quote me on that, but it's an early one for sure. And as far as Doom clones go, I think this is one of the better ones from this era. And while we're continuing to talk about first-person shooters, I want to talk about Turok Evolution on Game Boy Advance. Now, unlike all of the other games in the Turok series, this is not a first-person shooter. It's actually a 2D run-and-gun platformer. It's pretty similar to Contra or Metal Slug. It has really nice, colorful graphics, and you can play it in 2-player co-op, but it will require 2 Game Boy Advances and 2 copies of the game as well as a link cable. But the main benefit here is that you're not stuck to one screen. You can actually separate a little bit. But the gameplay changes up a little bit as well. There's some levels where it turns into a Cabal shooter. The camera angle turns into third person, and you run around side to side and use the cursor to shoot, much like Wild Guns or Cabal. Typically, when you think of games of the era being ported to a handheld console, it's usually not great. But the fact that they just made a totally new game that's exclusive to the console, it made it really stand out. So whether you're a fan of Turok or not, Turok Evolution on Game Boy Advance is totally worth trying out. Kenyuu Densetsu Yaiba came out exclusively for the Super Famicom in Japan. And I've never really heard anyone talk about this game. It's a top-down action RPG that can be played 2-player co-op. I'm not that familiar with the source material. It is based off of an anime that I've never watched, but I really do like the visuals here. It has some nice colorful cartoony graphics. And the gameplay is pretty similar to a Zelda type of game or Secret of Mana. As far as I know, there is yet to be a fan translation for this game. So hopefully that happens at some point, because as is, it is a little bit complicated to figure out some parts of this game, but it's still totally worth trying out with a friend. A game I've talked about a number of times on this channel is Bimini Run on the Sega Genesis. The game in and of itself isn't anything special, but the co-op mode is what elevates it into something worth trying out. It's a vehicle combat game where you drive a speedboat. Player 1 controls the boat, and Player 2 controls all of the shooting. So of course you gotta communicate and work together to take out the enemies. Each level you have specific objectives. Unfortunately, the environment kind of all looks the same, so it's easy to get lost. But you do have a map, so you're gonna wanna pull that up pretty often to figure out where you need to go. This is definitely an underrated co-op game on Sega Genesis, and I never really hear too many people talk about it, at least the co-op mode. Army of Two, the 40th Day, on the PlayStation Portable. When I first saw this, I assumed that it was just going to be a direct port of that game. And like I previously mentioned with Turok, usually when a modern game gets ported to a less powerful handheld system, it doesn't go very well. But also like Turok, Army of Two, the 40th Day is an exclusive game that only came out on the PSP. It's totally different from the console versions. And I think that's a good thing. Instead of a third-person shooter, this one plays more like a twin-stick shooter. It still has a lot of the same co-op gameplay where you gotta work together, but the combat and gameplay is different. The viewing angle is now kind of a top-down isometric view. And like I said, instead of being a third-person shooter, this one plays like a twin-stick shooter. Anyways, I've never heard anybody ever talk about this version of the game. So if you're like me and you just assumed that this was just a port of the PS3 and 360 game, give it a shot, as this is actually a really unique experience. Of course, you will need 2 PSPs and 2 copies of the game, but through emulation, it's easier than ever to be able to do this on one PC. You could just load up 2 instances of your PSP emulator and play it in split screen, and that works really well. So there are 10 more couch co-op hidden gems. What are some hidden gems you want us to play in the future? And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out our other co-op hidden gem videos. Thank you for watching.